This meeting is being recorded.
So, hi everyone. So as you know, for this week, we finished up reading our reading of 2 Samuel. And the story, and you'll notice, at least at the end of our Chronicles reading, this is where the story of David is actually taken up in a new way in Chronicles. So we won't talk about that today, but that is something that we'll catch up with in future weeks, because we get a lot more of the story of Solomon in Chronicles than we do in 2 Samuel. So just to flag that, that's still on the back burner for now. During our presentation today, I want to focus on the first few chapters of our reading, chapters 13 to 16, or really 15, with an eye toward tracing the web of allusions here to the stories of Cain and Abel, and the story of Jacob and his sons. In doing so, I want to pay attention to how curse and consequences work across generations, and look in and beyond the text for models of reconciliation that can break these patterns. So as a reminder, in chapter 12, we left David in an ambiguous place. He seemed to express the proper called for moral outrage in response to Nathan's peculiar parable about the poor man and his ewe. And he repents for his sins of sleeping with Bathsheba and killing Uriah. But we identified some ambiguity in his repentance, and especially in this strange act of placing on his own head a foreign crown, or the king, or a crown of a foreign king, or perhaps even a foreign god, depending on the translation. And in chapter 13, we see, for our reading for this week, we see the punishment pronounced by Nathan begin to play itself out. So just a reminder of what that punishment is. I'm going to share my screen. So in response to David saying, how could this rich man have done this? Nathan says, you are the man. And then the kind of curse or the punishment that's pronounced is, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So of course, the promise or the threat of great violence, and especially arising out of David's own house, which of course we see in the story of David's sons, and that all of this will take place in broad daylight. There's none of this any attempts to conceal what is happening will be thwarted. Because of the way David tried to conceal his own crimes in the case of the killing of Uriah. And so Amnon, David's son's own downfall, begins when he, like his father, sees a beautiful woman, his own half-sister, and begins to lust after her. Heeding the advice of his supposed companion, he lays in bed. This is back to Samuel 13. He lays in bed and has Tamar, his half-sister, brought to him by unwitting intermediaries. And in this, we can detect several parallels between Amnon's behavior and that of his father. At the start of the Bathsheba narrative, David too is lying in bed. We might remember he's waking up from his naps at evening time, and ultimately has Bathsheba brought to him by his men. So the same kind of image of passivity with these women being brought to him brought to them by others. And in Amnon's scheme, there's an ironic parallel here to the fate of Uriah. It is David himself who unknowingly acts as one of Amnon's messengers, sending Tamar to Amnon, leading to his own and, of course, many others' undoing, especially Tamar herself. And thus the behavior of the father is mirrored by his son. And in doing so, the consequences of the father's behavior multiplies, fulfilling the curse predicted by Nathan. And it's worth flagging here also that Absalom too, in that act of sleeping with his father's concubines on the roof, of course, also has these echoes and brings Nathan's curse fulfillment, with all of this being played out in daylight. So this tragic scene of the rape of Tamar is full of allusions to the Joseph story that serve to intensify this tragedy and also help us to think about its consequences. So here, the Joseph material, if you look back at the story of the rape of Tamar, the Joseph material is reworked in reverse. And so once Tamar is brought into Amnon's bedchamber, he repeats exactly the words of Joseph spoken before he reveals himself to his brothers. Amnon, like Joseph, says, "Clear out everyone around me." Of course, rather than setting the stage for a poignant moment of familial reconciliation, this instead is a prelude to an act of great violence, what Alter calls a fraternal rape that leads to fratricide. And the moment just before this violent act also echoes the encounter between Joseph and Potiphar's wife, where Potiphar's command of "lie with me" is amended by Amnon only to add that phrase, "lie with me, my sister." And then Tamar's lengthy and breathless reply to try to stop and reason with Amnon closely mirrors the reply with Joseph, at least on a structure, the reply of Joseph to Potiphar's wife, at least on a structural level. And it's also worth noting that her reply very precisely echoes what the concubine says at the end of Judges, if you remember that. Again, the terrible scene of violence that leads to civil war, like this scene will, where the concubine says, "Don't, brother, do this scurrilous thing." Of course, unlike Joseph, Tamar is not able to break away. And the allusions to the Joseph story, however, resume when attention is brought to Tamar's robe, the robe of many colors, or the royal tunic. The only other figure that's described as wearing that same garment is Joseph himself. This tunic, as in the Joseph story, is torn and bloody, just as it was by Joseph's brothers, to cover the crime. And so it's worth thinking about these allusions, of course, because again, it highlights this contrast here between this moment of, because the author or the narrator here is explicitly using these allusions, and especially to really draw this point of contrast between the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers and what's happening here, this event that's going to trigger fratricide and civil war. And also because it reminds us too of David, of Jacob's actions throughout the Joseph cycle, but also throughout Genesis as a whole, where David here is really playing the role of Jacob, both in his cleverness, as we saw, as both David and Jacob were young men, and then to their complete inability to handle their sons and respond to violence later on. And so when David hears of Amnon's actions, he's, quote, "greatly incensed, but fails to react. Absalom, the full brother of Tamar, is enraged, but bides his time in silence." David's response to Amnon's actions, like I said, to remind us of Jacob and his sons, specifically another scene, which is the rape of Dinah, which folks may or may not remember, but it's in Genesis 34, where again, there's some explicit allusions. In Genesis 34, Jacob and Leah's daughter Dinah is raped by a non-Israelite man, and Jacob hears about this and then keeps his peace. And his inaction leads Simeon and Levi to take matters into their own hands, killing the man who abused their sister, along with many other men, women, and children who lived in their town. David, too, hears of Amnon's actions, and his failure to respond, like Jacob's, paves the way for Absalom's own act of bloody retribution. As with Jacob after this point, David's sons seem to really run the show for the better part of his life and reign. This is really the moment where David kind of loses his grip over his rule, even as he responds, even as he's also shown in positive lights in later chapters. And so we're reminded here with both of these stories of Nathan's words about the sword, and also Bert's comments from last week, that once the sword is invoked, or really violence of any kind, it cuts in all directions. It multiplies itself in the same way that the logic of curse multiplies itself. And we can also remember, as he said before, that this is also the echo of David's own words when, after he has Uriah killed, he tells his commander not to feel too bad because the sword cuts in all directions. So after this, David's inaction, Absalom kills his brother and flees Israel. David pines for Absalom, but also seems to reinforce his exile in some sort of ambiguous way, that Absalom flees, and David's sad about Absalom being absent, but also Absalom would need his permission to return. So there's some ambiguity there. Joab, David's trusted commander, thinks it's politically expedient for the father and son to be reconciled, and convinces a, quote, wise woman to tell David yet another parable-like tale, this time the tale of her supposed two sons, one who kills the other after they quarrel, quote, in the field. After much back and forth, David finally concedes the point that the woman was fishing for, that the rest of her clan, the people who would be responsible for avenging the blood of her first son, should not kill her last remaining son to atone for the first son's murder. David, after having this kind of breakthrough moment of giving the woman of what she's looking for, sees through the woman's designs and recognizes that Joab is likely behind them. David agrees to bring Absalom back from exile to Jerusalem as Joab was hoping, on the condition that, quote, Absalom turn around to his house and my face he shall not see. So Absalom returns and he's incensed that after a couple of years, he's incensed that he hasn't seen his father. And that's where we have that strange moment that seems to apparently be about reunification, but still comes before Absalom's other acts of treachery and usurpation. So I'll share this verse. So in 2 Samuel 14, Absalom asks Joab, why did I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me were I still there. And now let me see the face of the king, and if there be guilt in me, let him put me to death. And then Joab came to the king and told him, and he called to Absalom, and he came to the king and bowed down to him, his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So again, we have this kiss. But it's noteworthy here that David here is referred only to the king. And this whole scene is cast in this kind of cold distance, where it's the king in his sort of role as political leader who kisses Absalom and allows him to, or it has this sort of political reunification, but seemingly not so there's a reunification between maybe king and subject or king and prince, but certainly not between father and son. Despite the kiss, it's sort of devoid of all warmth. And this is also echoed, the kind of coldness of this kiss is really brought out in the next scene, which also features the same act, where right after this, Absalom, musters for himself all of these forces and then stands by the gate of Jerusalem, and he stops each passerby and says, if I were judge, I would always rule in the favor of whoever came to me. So trying to win people over. And then it said that whenever a man came to do obeisance with him, he would put out his hand and take a hold of him and kiss him. So there's this sort of like forced kiss and this kind of grabbing of the other person. And it's worth noting here that this phrase for take hold is precisely the same verb used to describe Amnon taking hold of his sister Tamar. So we're invited to see like this as a kind of violent act. So again, this kiss here being the kind of cover for something else. And so we're left after this reunification scene and then the beginnings of Absalom's treachery to wonder if David was wise in following Joab's advice. And it's worth remembering here that the story of the wise woman who offered that sort of parable-like tale to David is patterned her story after the story of Cain and Abel. It's her two sons are fighting in the field and one kills the other. And if you remember in that story, Cain's exile was a punishment from God, but it was also a mercy. So he's exiled, but there's this mark of protection such that the death of Abel can't be avenged. God is protecting Cain from precisely that outcome. And so we're left thinking at this point in the story after this kiss, we're left thinking that the only options here maybe would be the continued exile for the protection of all of Absalom, or something of full reconciliation. And we're left wondering what would full reconciliation here between David and Absalom actually have looked like, given all that has passed between them. And so it helps to consider, maybe expand our imagination here. I want to compare this story, what we're reading here, to the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. And there's some interesting parallels first, remember that the story of the prodigal son is about, inheritance. And it's interesting that the wise woman frames the death of her son in terms of inheritance. That's one of the words that repeats itself over and over again in that tale is the word inheritance. So here in Luke 15, we have this alternate version of a father-son reunion. And note here that, so the son returns, and instead of the opposite of David kind of turning his back and saying, no, my son will not see my face, here the father runs towards his son, embraces him, and kisses him. So of course, a kiss that, is wrapped up with, is certainly not a calculated act, but rather is the result of deep emotion. And of course, we know David has a lot of depth of emotion towards his son Absalom, as we'll especially see in later chapters. I think it's worth looking to this text, but also to think beyond the text here, to again think about that question: what could reconciliation have looked like here, especially given the violence that precedes the scene of David and Absalom's kiss. And of course, as Christians, we also think about the kiss and Judas's betrayal of Christ. And then we also see, some Judas-like characters throughout these chapters, especially in Absalom, who, of course, betrays his father and dies sort of by hanging. And then Ahimelech, David's trusted advisor, who betrays him and also hangs himself. And the image of silver that repeats itself here is silver is this instrument of coercion that some people accept and some people deny to keep faith with others. And so these are the questions that I would like to explore in our discussion. But just to move us a bit further along in the story, to put some more material on the table. So after this, Absalom says he has to renew a vow in Hebron. At least the commentary I was reading emphasizes that at this point, when Absalom says to David, I want to go to Hebron, this would be the moment, or this would be the end of what would be like a 7-year penitential period where you would offer a sacrifice to God. And this would have been a potential pathway for atonement and a pathway at least for a sacrificial or liturgical reconciliation between Absalom and Israel at large, and especially with the cultic community. But instead, of course, he's going to Hebron, his father's old capital, to pronounce himself king, with 200 unknowing followers in tow. As soon as David is threatened by his son with this kind of rival kingship, we see David sort of come into contact with his old self. He kind of wakes up. His life is once again threatened, and he is heading back, keeps crossing over different boundaries, and heads back into the wilderness, where the active David that we know from his fleeing from Saul comes back into view. And so just as before, he was this sort of son fleeing the kind of father-like figure of Saul. Now David is a father fleeing the threat on his life from his literal son. But also these similarities between David as we see him now and his old self also serve to highlight the differences, or how David really has changed, especially now that Absalom is, especially as a result of Absalom's actions. So just a few examples of that. One is that as David's fleeing, he doesn't try to keep God's protection just for himself or to wrest it. So as his priestly followers are trying to take the Ark of the Covenant with them, David says, no, bring the Ark, and this is a direct quote, bring back the Ark of the Covenant to the town. Should I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see it in its abode. And should he say thus, I want no part of you, let him do to me what is good in his eyes. And of course, that's from chapter 15. And of course, we've been tracing that phrase, doing what is good in one's own eyes, doing what is good in others' eyes. And now we have David here saying, I'm going to do what's good in God's eyes. So this surrendered, much more humble David. We can also see kind of signs of David changing when that man Shimei is flinging stones at David, flinging stones in dirt and cursing him. And of course, the flinging of stones is this ironic reversal of David's victory against Goliath. And David just lets it pass and says, well, then God must have decreed whatever curse this man is saying. We can also track changes in David and his responses to death. After Jonathan and Saul died, we have that elegy that's moving, but also very formal in a lot of ways, as we discussed a few weeks ago. After the death of Abner, we have a much briefer elegy. After the death of his infant son, David gives somber words about his own mortality and death itself. And then now, after the death, when Absalom dies, we just get him repeating, Beni Absalom, Absalom, my son, over and over again in this kind of rhythmic. David's just obviously overcome by grief. And it's down to just those two words. Again, the kind of humbling of David. And I would like to suggest too that, so throughout this, we know that people keep, just in this pattern we traced before, people come to David after the death of Absalom saying that, your enemy has died. And of course, David is distraught. And then we get this description from Joab of David's actions that should remind us of that description of Amnon's feelings and kind of psychological state after he assaults his sister, that I think might be the beginnings of kind of pointing us our way out of these patterns of violence. So you might remember after Amnon assaults Tamar, it is said of him, let me find my quote. And Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for greater was the hatred with which he hated her than the love with which he had loved her after the act is completed. And then, in seemingly a reversal and an echo of that, we're told that David, after Joab accuses, this is an accusation to David after he's still grieving his son. Joab says, you have shamed all your servants who have saved your life today, and the lives of your, or he says, you have shamed all of your servants, essentially, by loving those who hate you and hating those who love you. For you have said today that you have no commanders or servants. And so I'm reminded there of, the words of Christ, of course, to love your enemies. And then also of Christ's words about, if he who does not hate his mother and his father and follow me. So while David certainly is falling short of the Christ ideal, we see here, these echoes or these foreshadowing of Christ's own words that seem to point this way out. And of course, we see David over and over again in these scenes reconciling with his enemies or choosing not to engage in these patterns of retribution, which we also saw him trying to do earlier. But of course, before he was doing it by killing the person who came to bear the message. And now we see something of a more complete turn or reversal of those patterns in him. And by the end, these changes are also thrown into sharp relief by the characters who remain the same, especially Joab, who, this whole thing started when, when Abner kills Joab's brother in battle, where they're kind of in this battle formation where they're coming very close together and men are battling very much face to face, kind of within sword's reach of each other. And that's exactly, and then Joab goes to kill Abner, and that's the kind of first falling out between Joab and David. And then here too, we see Joab killing someone else too, who has betrayed David in this same way. So his actions just are very, very much repeat themselves in a very literal way. Again, highlighting the characters that do change. And then finally, and we'll explore this more next. So let's leave it there, but just to say too that the book ends, the very final act here is David buying the land on which the temple will be built. And so that'll be our starting point for next week.
Mm-hmm.
So let's open it up there, maybe potentially specifically on the question of reconciliation and what indicators or starting points we might have here for, like we said, breaking these cycles, but also for real reconciliation between those who have harmed one another, and especially an alternative to that blood avenging system. If others notice any patterns there or had thoughts on that.
Oh, Emma was asking if there's if there's light shed on, or questions about what reconciliation means that we gain insight into in this material. I don't know if this is saying anything other than what Emma was saying, but I was struck by the with David's reconciliation with Absalom, that it did seem like there was a type of like there's a kind of excluded middle here, and that's what he did. Like he could have kept Absalom away, like he already wasn't going to the hilt, in his response, because he could have, even though Absalom sort of put himself at some distance from David. I mean, David still could have went and sought him out and killed him, but David didn't do that. So there's that sense of the place for the one. You get far enough away, and then you're protected from blood guilt. So it seems like that's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution. And then there's the more radical solution that Emma pointed to, that we have the best example of in the New Testament. But yeah, he did a kind of half-hearted middle ground where he sort of went along with other people saying, well, you should really reconcile with him. Okay, kind of, yeah. And then, but that just actually made for the worst possible solution, which I find so psychologically insightful, because I think that's true of how we do, like, we want to do the best. Or maybe someone else leads us along to it, like, well, you've got to do the right thing. Okay, I guess I do have to, but you can't make me do it in my heart. Yeah, and then that keeps things going in a bad way.
Yeah. On the blood revenge, anthropologists have studied that in a lot of societies, and the interesting thing about it is it's a non-state based system of retribution. It's based on the kin. So the family appoints a blood avenger to go and kill whoever killed a family member, but it doesn't work as in this case when it's a family member who kills another family member. That generally in blood revenge, it assumes that the perpetrator is from another family, is not a kin, and that sets the two families into a blood feud. But here, and this is an interesting case kind of sociologically, because in the first place, it's a conflict between the older kin-based retribution system and this newly imposed system of the state. It's like, oh, what's the Greek play of the woman who buries her brother? Begins with an A, and I'm having a senior moment.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. That one.
I'll think of it, but this is interesting because it is. I guess this isn't very theological; it's more sociological. But it's precisely at this point when the state is being born, and there's a conflict between the older kinship-based approaches to authority, which existed under the judges, and this new claim to authority of a king. And so part of this ambiguity here might be that that David is caught up in the old notions of blood feud, but also the newer notion of him being king.
What that reminds me of Harry, is that I feel that we're being invited to, in this, I think that that Samuel is inviting us to take I think very much in Judges also, to take the kinship understanding and apply it to the whole people, because there's a strong perspective against sort of a fratricide, but it's not a fratricide of the kin, but it's a fratricide of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's like, and the bad characters are the ones who just keep killing other Israelites. And I think we're continually invited to see that maybe the kinship model you're talking about should apply to the whole people.
Just that, who is my brother's keeper, or am I my brother's keeper? But of course, we're all our brother's keeper. We're all, that sort of. But it's interesting. Yeah, you do see it come to a head at the end here when it's like Judah's like David's ours, and then the others are saying, no, David's 10 parts ours. And there's that kind of dividing up of who owns the king along these familial lines. And of course, that partially devolves into, and part of the impetus that devolves into the next step of the Civil War here is that conflict. So I guess I see what you're talking about, Harry, especially in that moment.
Yeah. Oh, and it's Antigone is
Yes, there we go.
a senior moment. Is
Yeah.
It's Antigone where the king orders
Yeah.
that her brother is not to be buried, and she disobeys the king to bury her brother, an act of early civil disobedience, but clearly the conflict between kin-based authority and the state-based authority.
But I really think that this is going the other. I think we're invited to see I think we're being told to see them in the same way, actually, in that David is, and that what David does right is his not seeking retribution against, the house of Saul, for example. But then what he does wrong is by not, I don't know quite how to put this, but obviously he doesn't fully get that right.
I was thinking of the contrast between Absalom and David and Saul, because Saul respected the kinship and the anointing of David, respected the kingship of Saul and his anointing, even though he had already been told that he would be taking over. But Absalom, hasn't been given any authority to take over, and there's no reason. He doesn't respect his father, and when he gets back, he doesn't respect him as a king by going to him right away and saying he's sorry. So he doesn't. He's like the younger generation that doesn't follow the traditions of David's generation.
It's interesting, right? The generational break, though. It's not just like pure ingratitude, though, right? Like we're just invited to see something sympathetic there in terms of like David's inaction, his failure there to kind of preserve, or rather his failure to come up with I don't know. It really is like, what was David to do? Kind of like what was Jacob? I mean, Jacob, it's not about siblings, but to some extent you had that same question being asked there. It's, you had this like horrendous act of violence in a brother, from brother to sister, and then, brother wanting to protect the sister. That's this very, I don't know. Sorry, I'm distracted by something that's going on outside here. But there's the question of like,
is something bad happening out there?
the cat.
Oh,
Sorry, our
okay,
house
sorry.
is distracted by a cat pooping outside.
Okay, I was hoping the cat wasn't stalking a squirrel and just want to do. Okay.
Anyway, but rather, so I guess the point. Very distracted. I'm just gonna stop talking. So, I can't say.
I'm sorry. I said that in order to allow it to come up so that we could then move on. But, sorry, I wasn't trying to.
So I guess the thing that I would like us to think about is what is that question of like after Amnon assaulted like Tamar, like what was David to do in that moment? He obviously failed to meet the moment, but within this framework of blood guilt and blood vengeance, it's like what was supposed to be done and what was the alternative there? Like what would have been the righteous thing to do in that case, even within the framework of the text itself, what would have been the righteous thing to do?
Well, it didn't towards the end of the Samuel book, the reason God says that Solomon has to build the temple is because David has blood on his hands and Solomon doesn't yet. So even though it seemed like God approved of a lot of the things David did, his authority is being taken away from him because of his blood guilt.
Yeah, specifically they're the blood of Uriah, right? So it's not so much directly related to the incident with Tamar.
One, as far as like David having blood on his hands, he says that later on he's going to say he does because of Joab. And I was wondering what the other readers thought of Joab, because he's actually kind of a strange figure as the way he's presented. He's obviously presented as like a bad guy, right? I mean, in many obvious ways, he's a bloody, vengeful, self-interested man. But on occasion, at least, he's presented as being in the right, with the census, say. For some reason, he was astute enough to realize that that was a bad, which is an odd thing for someone like that to be, presented as realizing something like that. And also the fact that David keeps putting up with him, even though he has lots of reasons not to, and eventually does tell Solomon to get rid of him once David is dead. But David doesn't get, like, he's going to try, right? He's going to make Amasa commander instead. And that's why Joab kills Amasa, to get him out of the way. So yeah, like that, this very strange relationship. And like, it seems significant. It's emphasized by the text. But you're not given a whole lot to go on as to what you're invited to make of that.
Yeah. I guess the impression I had is that Joab is kind of, at any critical juncture, Joab does have a lot of power over David and sort of strong arms his way back in. And we're told at one point, even after Amasa is made commander, it says, right after that, it says, and Joab's armies followed him, right? It's like the armies are Joab's here. And I think we start to see that divide, especially when David becomes more sedentary after he's king and Joab is the one leading the armies into battle, that you see, yeah, it's sort of like that fissure comes partially through David's inaction. But of course, it actually comes earlier after Joab kills Abner. So it's sort of like, yeah, Joab seems to be the character that embodies this like blood guilt cycle on the battlefield. Yeah, and it's kind of like the shadow of like David kind of taking these measures to try to move beyond it in a lot of cases, and Joab being this figure that's the kind of like, no, but this is what you should do, but this is what you should do, kind of back into those same logics, which is not to say everything's Joab's fault here, but rather he seems to at least be the figure that represents that in some way, this kind of thirst for blood, even motivated by a sort of righteousness, but often or righteousness according to one set of logics, but certainly not one that has an eye toward the end of bloodshed.
How do you escape the shadow?
Yeah.
Come to this side of the table. You're going to be in the shadow regardless. Here. No, that was a joke. That was a joke.
Yeah.
No,
no,
you
you're
did
good.
it. You did it. It's just funny to me. You guys are both in the shadow, so that's
Yeah.
why. That's the big question, though. How to get shadow.
I think it's like one intimation of that, right, is like the simple answer is love, which we're at least given the first glimpses at here. Of course, with the opposite being like, there's the kind of love that Amnon had for Tamar at the start of the story, where like we're told he loves her, and we're like, whoa, what is that? What is that love here? But by the end, I think in David towards Absalom, we see something of real love. That is, love for those who hate you.
I was thinking about the last question you asked him about like what was David to do about Amnon, and I was just thinking of other maybe the contexts that don't come through really clearly in this text. Like I think of like, what if this were Deuteronomy? Then it would be like, well, there's a law about this, like, and you can't go you can't be on the nearest, you can't go beyond it. So like there are kind of like there's a statutory context for retribution, which it seems like in a lot of these instances, it works itself out organically. It's people sort of venting the steam kind of, but there's also this context where that's supposed to be this far and no further. And you don't get you don't get a sense for that, like people sort of deferring to the law or deferring to authority like David. So who's an authority over David? Well, clearly the prophets are, in some like this, like the figure of Nathan, or later on there's this other seer. Like, does he go to them? Or also I think of Job, at the very beginning, like he's sacrificing to God in case one of his sons did something wrong and didn't know they had done it. And it's like, well, yeah, is there that sense of trying to be righteous before God in I don't know, in terms of the law or the sacrificial cult. I'm just thinking of paradigms that I'm not seeing here.
Yeah.
That besides the biggest one.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because at least in the case of the story of Dinah in Genesis 34, that's a case where Jacob does try to take steps to what would then later be the law, which is that the person who assaults you, like you have to marry, like they have to marry the woman whom they've assaulted. And that's supposed to be at least the restoration of societal standing, if not, of course, reparation for other types of harm done, for other harms done, or bodily harm done. But in the case of Jacob there, Jacob does try to set that up. Like we're told that like this person, I forget his name, actually turns out afterwards he did come to love Dinah and then wants to marry her. And Jacob's trying to make that happen. And that's when the brothers kill the man who assaulted their sister. And we're said like, the question there is very dramatic. It's like, they ask like, should our sister be treated like a whore, is like what this text says. So there's a sense that like that, whatever the law had said for at least one type of restitution in that case, social restitution and standing is, of course, even within the text itself, it has the same objection that we would have to that idea of restitution, at least in the case of Levi and Simeon. So I guess to me, I was thinking a lot about, the story of Cain and Abel as we're invited to see it by the wise woman, at the first wise woman that we encounter here. Yeah. And thinking about like, fratricide and like going back to Adam and Eve. I don't really know about this, but like Han's reading of the Adam and Eve story is that Adam sort of, that there was a moment where Adam fails to protect Eve. And then even before he blames her, it's like in this encounter with the serpent, he sort of absents himself and allows this to play out. So I was reminded of that, this close relationship between this betrayal of women here, and specifically, even in the ways that make us uncomfortable, the failure to protect there, and of course the original sin itself, and then fratricide. And there seems to be in Genesis like this close interlinking with the former being the thing that's kind of this problem that isn't really dealt with by the text itself. But I guess in terms of the practical nature of this story, I was struck by here exile being in the story of Cain and Abel, and then also in the case of Absalom, potentially the benevolent thing to do, exile as like the opportunity for like penance and repentance. That where distance prevents the blood guilt cycle from continuing. And of course, we're nearing the moment of Israel's own exile, which of course is, invited to see it in similar terms, at least by the prophets.
I have another question about the census. Now, back in a few books back, I forget it was Deuteronomy or Leviticus or something, they were always counting how many people were around, how many soldiers one tribe had compared to another tribe. So if they have a history of counting everybody constantly at every situation, why is having a census wrong? Is it just insulting God because God might come up short because there's not as many people as there are stars in the skies, or what is?
Well, speaking as a Christian anarchist, a census is a means of the state controlling the people, and is often, as in David's case, was conducted for military purposes. So those of us, I would say part of the prohibition of the census makes an awful lot of sense if God really doesn't want a state form of government for his people, if God wants to be the king and not have human kings, which is what Samuel says to begin with.
Or at least, one, and we've touched on this before, like for those of us who are inclined to a more pacifistic stance, the violence of the Old Testament is uncomfortable, but it is actually a different, it's not the kind of violence we see like in the modern state where we depend on, human strength, military strength. It's like God is saying, I'm fighting for you. And really, it doesn't matter. I can do it 300 men or 300,000, just as easy. So maybe if you're right there, and like the census is like, okay, how many troops do I have? Maybe that isn't the same motive as earlier censuses, which are just more generically like how many people are there here. If it is like some kind of like, well, can I afford to like get entangled in this or that conflict? Like that's alien to the logic of God as the people's defender, where he can fight through, a handful of men just as easily. So maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, but I don't have particular words that justify that here, but I was looking at the Song of David. That's a chapter before that. There's no one particular line to point to, but it seems like David's confidence is in the rock, the Lord, not whether he has 700,000 and 500,000 under his command. So I wonder if we're invited to see that in juxtaposition, or if that's a reach.
Yeah, and I also think like when we think about numbers in the way that they're usually, in the way you brought up, Mary, they're usually symbolic of some kind, right? Like at least Alter's commentary is always talking about it. 7 times 10, both are numbers of wholeness, so there's something like numbers being symbolic, but that, so every time you see a number, it doesn't mean there has been counting. So I know that comes to mind. And that also the kind of thread that we were tracing earlier of like multiplication, right? Which is like God multiplies blessing, but also curse multiplies in the way that you guys were suggesting there. So numbers being this kind of dangerous game that's better left to God to multiply. And potentially also it's better left to God to count in that same way.
I'm wondering what you all are thinking in this part about what this is supposed to teach us about covenant. Because I have to admit that this has not been my favorite experience so far with this part, the Samuel David extravaganza. And it doesn't take too far back to where it's still kind of hard. And I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but I'm trying to figure out if this is our theme. We're spending a lot of time on this stuff, and I'm not very clear how this is supposed to be helping me in particular, right? Understand deeper what kind of covenant I'm supposed to be having. I mean, I think I get the message that God isn't interested in having other gods be worshipped. That's been kind of reiterated to the point of ad nauseum. So I'm a little frustrated because I'm not sure I'm getting what the clue is. And I'm wondering if it's because I'm not a Jew, looking at it from a Jew's perspective. I don't have some of the other history that would help me to understand this in a deeper way. And that I'm retrospectively trying to look at it as a Christian, which is fine. But I'm just I'm struggling a lot with that. I mean, the narrative is fine, but it's as a narrative. But I kind of feel like I'm reading Shakespearean histories at the moment more than I'm reading something that's supposedly telling me something about my relationship with God.
Yeah.
And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm just really lost in the weeds.
No, yeah. Thanks, Leah, for that question. I think it's a very timely as we're finishing 2 Samuel. And of course, the story continues into Kings. But the first thing that comes to mind is the word hesed. I know that's one of the main takeaways that I'll have from these stories, which is what God's faithfulness, God keeping his promise even when humans don't, and how we see that playing out here. In the ways that we do see, in the limited ways, the way that we see humans doing the same, that there's at least a glimpse of what it could look like for humans to act with hesed in the image of God, to be faithful.
Are you really, honestly, I'm sorry, Emma, this is what you are getting from this place, this stuff we're reading? Seriously, I mean, that's not what I'm getting. I mean, I'm getting Dynasty. I'm getting Game of Thrones. And that's fine. I mean, but what are we supposed to learn from that? I don't think it's hesed, and maybe that's something that would be nice to be seeing here. I'm not seeing it. I'm struggling. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think that Emma's right, but I think that I think that the problem is that it's not in a moral key. It's not like we're seeing the playing out of hesed in some material that has enough blood in it to be Game of Thrones-ish. So, and I think that to us, that disqualifies it from being a text that could show us something about it, but it is still put in those terms. It's still saying that this like God is involved in this. God isn't the one telling people to do sinful things. So this is a sinful people, but it's still a story of God's hesed. It's just, I think that the moral of the story, you can't find verse to verse, because you don't have like the sort of the eye of the storm. Like you have to find that, like it isn't there. Like this, the moral center isn't with us as we're going like line to line.
I think I don't know about the story as a whole. I would be tempted to kind of agree with Leah. I mean, like the direct, like, this is what happens. I mean, I guess the only like overarching thing I can think of here, which I guess is a useful point, is kind of that, like suppose all this is a punishment from God. And of course, that can be pretty a disturbing idea. It's like, well, surely God didn't make all those people commit all these various sins that are going to bring all this trouble, right? But I think a better way to look at curse all through all the New Testaments is that evil, like if you do evil, it will work out this way. Like the consequence, we've talked about, the consequences are not limited. So in one sense, David breaks loyalty with Uriah, and loyalty is just shattered in every direction. And interestingly, it's not really going to, like, after Solomon, the kingdom breaks up. And of course, Solomon is David and Bathsheba's child. Like you can't break loyalty with one. You can't have a limited breaking of loyalty, I guess, would be my overarching takeaway. The minor detail, which I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, is all through the David cycle. There's the good foreigner. David, of course, being descended from Ruth, so a Moabite, the worst foreigners of all. And it's notable that he goes and brings his family to Moab for safety when he's fleeing Saul, right? So he's still the Moabite connection is there. David is actually, in that sense, tainted as a foreigner. But all through, quite often the foreigner is playing the role of the one who keeps faith when the people don't. David is like surprised that his old commander from Gath, right, is still with him. It's like, why don't you just switch allegiance? You're not a local. And he's like, well, I swore, I'm the king's man. Uriah, of course, a type of loyalty to the law. The guy that gets the blessing from the ark, who's a foreigner. So one of the, like, of course, that's a minor detail, but of course for us, especially as, we're not coming from a Jewish perspective, keeping in mind that, like, for God, loyalty is what matters and not genetics, not the particular bloodline. So I guess those, like, as far as I can find them, those are the two, like, helpful themes that we could pull out of this very sordid story.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think also for me, perhaps the one clear-cut moral theme came from First Chronicles 22, when I think as Mary mentioned earlier, when David is telling Solomon that he would have to build a temple, and he says, "My son, it was my purpose to build a house myself for the honor of the Lord my God, but this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and you have waged great wars. You may not build a house in my honor because you have shed too much blood." That the shedding of blood was not just Uriah, but David is being held responsible by the Lord here for the wars he's waged, that they're not God, he wasn't waging God's wars. I kind of latched onto that one.
Yeah.
I think
Can I
another-
ask too, did anybody else, I mean, did when Solomon builds the temple, are we talking about that next week? Is that what you said, Emma?
Yeah, that'll be
Yeah,
one of
I'll
the,
wait on that. I'll wait.
I think another, I don't know, just trying to think of like a higher level answer is that I think that, yeah, I think that the text isn't constructed for it to do a lot for us in our world. I think we're invited to bring ourselves into its world. I think that's the it's helpfulness. Like we to find ourselves within it. And I don't know, I think a lot about that as we pray the liturgy of the hours of the time. So we're praying all of these psalms, and it's not like praying with like we could be reading Epictetus or something like that, and every line instead would be like something that's like, oh yeah, this is a zinger about how to live my life. Whereas instead in Liturgy of the Hours, we're just being constantly invited to be like, no, you're actually in this other story. And it's really, I mean, sort of you like it or not, if it seems moral or immoral, a good example or bad, it's all there. But in order to be able to take it as something helpful, essentially that we could only do that consistently if I'm actually trying to enter into it. And I think that's the invitation. And it's a hard invitation, but I think that, I don't know, I think that's a helpful paradigm.
yeah. I also think about one of the things we were talking about during our Friday retreat, and I might have also talked about this last week. I actually might have said this exact same thing, but nonetheless, it still rings true. Would be, yeah, like as I'm reading this, also to what you were saying, Malcolm, sort of building out this kind of like detailed sense of like the architecture of sin and how it works. That the sword will always cut one way and then the other. But then of course these texts are tracing sin across generations, but also, yeah, like you were saying, Malcolm, like not keeping faith in one sphere, like that will seep into all spheres, and the kind of moral fabric and how it breaks down, and these few moments where you can see it sort of getting rethreaded and like repaired in these small ways, whether that's the like scene of like we talked about with Ruth, the kind of like undoing of certain narrative threads in the figure of Ruth, that I think we can begin to see in the David story, at least when he's sort of submitted and more humble at the end of his life. And so those are the things that, like, if we think about it sort of as an architecture of sin and its undoing, then I see myself in a lot of these characters. And that's something that I found particularly helpful is to see that. And I think that the robust narrative that we get in this part of in the David cycle really has helped me to do that, to think about how sin functions in a person.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Architecture of sin, I like that. It's good.
So I hope any of that was somewhat helpful, Leah.
It is. I mean, I think that it's helpful to, I mean, I think that the question of being in covenant with all who have gone before us in faith, right? In whatever that means, right? The great cloud of witnesses, you know, that somehow this is, their stories can then be, they are moral, an immoral exemplar, maybe in the wrong way, but it's still a way of showing us something. And I think that's helpful. I think that the hard part for me is kind of the unrelentingness of it. If the message is that we really have a hard time, we really have a hard time over and over, that's how it kind of feels.
Yeah.
But it seems to be connected, at least in the way that I'm reading it, to the ways in which we have difficulty with power and with resources, and how that continually comes up, that we just don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
We don't know how to do that. And those who have it, even, you know, Pharaoh, when he has it, he doesn't know how to use it right. And so there is that question of how this helps to reflect that for me a little bit, you know, into kind of entering into the difficulty of trying to take on power and possessions and, you know, force in the world, my own force in the world, and instead just assume it under God all the time. It's hard.
Yeah. And in terms of covenant, because I know that's the specific question you asked and where my initial response was coming from in terms of thinking about covenant, remembering too that covenant, as we're invited to see it in scripture, is fundamentally like family making. And so, you know, Scott Hahn writes about this a lot, like thinking about scripture as a family story and our family story. And so that might be to help connect up some of these threads that we were just speaking about. Might be you can connect it, I think, to covenant as a central framework by thinking about it in terms of a family. And if we think about, like, I read this and I'm like, wait, wasn't David supposed to be reading the story of Jacob at this point? Like, how could he not have known better? Sort of, if you're sort of reading the story of Jacob in a way that's sort of confusing to me, how we're supposed to understand how these texts are present for these characters. But then also that seeing that invitation for myself too, that like, oh, this is sort of the family story that you're supposed to learn from. Yeah, seeing ourselves inside that in the way you were talking about it, in terms of like being in covenant with those who went before and those who come after.
Well, I think David uses the word covenant a lot, and David's name is carried on, you know, through Israeli history into the time of Jesus, the time of Paul. They carry David's name along. You know, people were telling stories about David, you know, for generations afterward, and David is somebody who is tied to the idea of covenant. It means something to him, and even if he's done bad things, the covenant was important to him, and that's one of the things that the Israelis did. It was they made a record of everything and what they stood for, and it's carried on tradition from father to son to the next generation, and they had something, you know, to carry them forward to the Christian period, and the Christians remember David's stories too. So it's yeah, maybe you have to have a good story back in the old days of the biblical history, just to help carry along that story, to carry along, and the story carries the idea.
Yeah, we have to remember our story and remember, like, this is our family, as Emma was saying, like a really dysfunctional one. We're all one big dysfunctional family. And like God works with it, with what we are and who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that might be, unless there's other burning comments, might be a good note to end on for today. Unless you were going to say something else.
No, just thinking of Jesus in a particular way in relation to this part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, Leah, also the good news, which is that we have one more week on Solomon and the death of David, and then we go to Jesus in the Gospel of John. So we have these hopefully well-timed turns to the Gospels that that hopefully offer, some sense of relief, at least for the kind of like moral guidance that I think, we're all looking for, that might sustain us for the next chunk of our journey.
Well, I have one fear that as a retiree of the US Census Bureau, do I have to choose between famine, destruction by foreigners, or
Plague.
pestilence?
Yeah.
Take pestilence.
Yeah.
That's
We've already
Yeah.
had that.
Yeah.
the 3-day version.
Yeah.
Oh,
Not the
A
3-year.
3-year version.
Yeah. It was all because of you, Mary.
Yeah.
The other thing is, our pastor recommended that we watch The Chosen, that series, and we've been watching it here at home and just, couldn't put it down. We've watched all 3 seasons already. And I think it's really good. The stories that they make up for the back stories of the apostles make a lot of sense and tie in with the parables and the miracles and so on.
That's actually one of the ground rules we have for these sessions, is that you can't talk about The Chosen. We let
Oh.
most things go, but
Okay. Okay.
but that's one that we have to hold a line on.
Okay, I
Just
didn't
kidding.
hear about
Just
that one.
I'm glad you're talking about it, because I have some prejudice against it, so I need to give it more of a shot.
Well, on that note,
Okay.
thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you on Saturday. Dawn says bye, Mary and Wade.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah.
done. Bye. Bye.
See ya.
Okay.
Bye.
I-
Yeah.